Hello and welcome to the third in the series of sessions on architecture and philosophy. Today's session will be on Michel Foucault. I'm delighted, excuse me, I'm delighted to be joined today by three very distinguished guests. We have Sanford Kwinter, in many ways doesn't need any introduction, but deserves an introduction. Sanford is one of the leading intellectuals, I'd say, in architectural culture right now. He's trained as a philosopher, has a PhD in comparative literature, and has taught a number of different institutions, from Rice University to MIT to Harvard, and is currently a professor at Pratt. He was also the founding editor of Zone Books. Behnaz Farahi is an architect by training. She has a master's degree from Iran and also from USC, and a PhD from the Cinema School in USC. She is an interactive designer, an architect, and critical maker, I should say, and is a recipient of a number of awards. Most recently, the Cooper Hewitt Digital Design Award for 2021. She is currently an assistant professor at CSU Long Beach. And last but not least, Peter Macapia, who is an artist and architect. He's the founder and director of the Experimental Lab Design Office for Research and Architecture in New York and Paris. He started Labdora in 2003 after receiving a PhD from Columbia, where he was a recipient of the presidential fellowships. His interests involved the problem of geometry in the age of computation, and the geometry and typology of matter-energy relations, and the possibility of an elastic density in the contemporary metropolis. I knew him from a few years back, from when he was contributing toward the architecture biennial Beijing, some projects to do with computation. And he's been teaching currently at Pratt University, where he's also a professor. He has been teaching courses in Michel Foucault. So it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce these speakers today, and I think it's going to be a tremendous session. So just to say briefly, this is a continuation of the series that was initiated over the summer, a series that we referred to as the Digital Consortium initially, but calling the Doctoral Consortium. The first part of this series was hosted by Tongji University and consisted of a series of lectures, which you can find online. I've shown you here the link to the YouTube library of recordings. And these included lectures by Sanford himself and Manuel Delander, also from Pratt, Slavoj Žižek, and Erin Manning, Anna Maria Duran-Callisto, and so on. In fact, you can find the lectures also from the sessions from this previous two sessions on this series in the same repository of recordings. We start off with Walter Benjamin, and then we had one on Jean Baudrillard. And next week, we'll be looking at Frederick Jameson. Following that, on the 14th of November, we have a very interesting session, I would say, on Derrida and Cixous, where we bring in not only Peter Eisenman and Bernard Schumi, two distinguished architects and theorists who collaborated with Derrida, but also Doina Petrescu, an architecture professor and activist herself, who was a student under both Derrida and Cixous in Paris. Then we move on to Deleuze, and towards the end of the session, we're going to hopefully introduce an extra one on Luce Rigore, in addition to the session on Judith Butler and Simondon. So today, I want to start with a very brief clip of Michel Foucault. He speaks a bit in English first of all, then he goes into French. And the purpose of showing this is really just really to emphasize why we are doing these sessions. So let me just play Michel Foucault.
Answer in French, because my English is so bad that I would be ashamed to answer in English. Là, il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Mais je m'en méfie pour la raison suivante. Je crois que...
So part of the reason for putting together these sessions is that there are so few recordings of these distinguished thinkers that we have. This is the one I could find where he was speaking mainly in French. Of course, he gave many lectures in English when he was teaching at UC Berkeley, but we don't have many. And as we shift from an age where the podcast has become increasingly important, it struck me as being a vital sort of component that we're able to put together and record some discussions by leading experts as a repository for students worldwide. So each of these sessions will be uploaded and will be available for everybody around the world as a resource, and to collect thoughts and ideas, not only through experts of in this particular area, but also from those who actually studied under these particular individuals. And I think Sanford Kwinter in particular stands out because he was a student of Foucault in Paris many years ago. So who was Michel Foucault? He was born in 1926 in Poitiers in France. He came from a long family of surgeons, and his father expected him to go into medicine, but instead he went into philosophy. And his main concern in his work is to examine the past as a means of diagnosing the present. For Foucault, there was no essential order or meaning behind things, and everything was therefore to be judged according to a framework of knowledge which was forever changing. Foucault referred to the broad changes in intellectual outlooks as epistemes or epistemes, periodizations of knowledge, not dissimilar to Thomas Kuhn's paradigms. History for Foucault had to be understood according to the epistemes, the epistemes and discourses of the past. It was through a genealogical analysis of the past that we would inevitably gain some insight into the way in which the present had been produced. Unlike our two previous thinkers, we were looking at the question about whether they make it to America or not. Benjamin died tragically on his way trying to get to America to flee Nazi-occupied Europe. Baudrillard made it to America and wrote very scathingly about America. Foucault, on the other hand, went to America and became a professor there. It's a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, and in some senses liked America too much. He died in 1984 as a result of AIDS that he contracted in a gay bar in San Francisco. What I want to do today is really offer no more than a kind of schematic outline of Foucault, trying to highlight some of the kind of key books, the key ideas and the key ways of thinking in his work, and to focus particularly on one particular discussion of one particular building, the Panopticon, and try and draw out the relevance of his discussion for architects. In a sense, what we're trying to do through this series is try and find out what architects can learn from philosophy. And by looking at some of these critical thinkers, all of whom were included in the book Rethinking Architecture, which was published almost 25 years ago, to really ask the question whether their thinking is still relevant to architecture today. So let me just briefly say that there are a series of books that Foucault was responsible for over the years from the 1970s through to 1984, of which possibly these are the most important. Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, The Order of Things, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Discipline and Punish, and a 3-volume edition of The History of Sexuality, the final volume of which was published as Foucault was dying of AIDS. And while these kind of look at different subjects, it's fair to say there's a consistent kind of refrain or consistent approach, consistent critique that governs all of them. For example, he looks towards the past as a way of, in a sense, critiquing the present. While we're led to believe that things have improved over the time and the past is no longer so relevant, Foucault looks back to the past and looks for ideas that have been somehow lost or left behind as a way of critiquing the present. For example, the whole question about madness, about insanity becomes an issue, whereas in the past, individuals were somehow celebrated when they were somewhat insane as being different. Now they are consigned to some asylum and shut away. One thinks perhaps of some of the leading individuals in our world today. One thinks perhaps of people who suffer from something like Asperger's, which is seen as an abnormality. Albert Einstein had Asperger's, so does Greta Thunberg, and so does Elon Musk. Is it such an abnormality, or is it in some senses something special? This same kind of approach also, he took the same approach towards the question about medicine. While not denying that medical standards had in some sense improved, the problem was that somehow the patient had been somehow become part of a kind of clinic and diagnosed in a scientific way, and the sense of the person as totality had somewhat been lost. The same goes to to questions about criminality and punishment. Whereas in the past there were these somewhat gruesome public events that were being held. In some senses, the present is even worse. It's in somewhat even more cruel in some senses, in the sense that the prisoners are just hidden behind in a institution, and it's almost, in some senses, worse for Foucault in that sense. In terms of the book Rethinking Architecture, I want to just kind of briefly look at the kind of genealogy, shall we say, of the way that that Foucault approaches a particular subject, and that is the buildings and control. There are 3 articles or 3 pieces by Foucault in Rethinking Architecture of other spaces, utopias and heterotopias, and then there's the one that addresses the Panopticon itself, an extract from Discipline and Punish called Panopticism. And finally, there is an interview with Paul Rabinow called Space, Knowledge and Power. I want to address briefly the second and the third of these. And I also will add a few comments from an article by Gilles Deleuze, where he kind of, in a sense, adds to this kind of this line of thinking. What I want to suggest that this notion of the episteme, or these different frames of thinking, these different ways of approaching things, which kind of echo in some senses the paradigms of Thomas Kuhn, see a sort of development from Foucault from a kind of a structuralist perspective excuse me, towards a post-structuralist one, a more loose and kind of free way of thinking. And I want to trace that in the session today. So let me just say a few brief words about his essay of other spaces, utopias and heterotopias, where he's looking at these kind of spaces of otherness, that is to say, cemeteries, brothels, and so on. And although I won't go into this, it was more a kind of static notion, in the sense this is the space in which certain things are contained and certain practices take place. And he, in some sense, reflects his general sort of view that I was outlining in the way he describes this. The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. In civilizations where it is lacking, dreams dry up, adventure is replaced by espionage, and privateers by the police, which kind of reflects that general sort of shift in which maybe there are things from the past we can use to critique the present. But I want to focus for a moment on this particular building, Design for a Building, which forms part of Foucault's work, and I want to sort of reflect on what is its relevance for architecture. This is a version of the Panopticon, a design of the Panopticon that was initially devised by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. Jeremy Bentham was a social reformer and a philosopher. Disappointingly for Bentham, this was never acted upon. It was never actually built, although he got an architect to draw up the designs for it. But nonetheless, it was in subsequent years became the kind of model for many penitentiaries and prisons. Briefly put, what we have is a circular plan where there are cells around the outside in which the prisoners are housed. These are all radially designed so they look towards a central tower. The tower is where the guard operates. Now, importantly, the tower is kind of obscured by some kind of screen or gauze, whereby you're not aware of whether or not the guard is watching you. In other words, you are kept under continuous kind of potential surveillance. You don't know if you've been watched, but you have to assume that you are being watched. And that, as Foucault puts it, guarantees the subjectification of the prisoners. They become, as a result of that, docile subjects because they internalize that gaze and are aware of the potential of always being seen by the guard. And this is the view that the guard would get, the central tower the tower in the center, which of course the prison does not know whether the guard is there watching. And of course the guard can't watch altogether, but nonetheless, that such is the kind of the ingenuity of the structure that there's this potential sense of always being watched. In some ways, this was actually realized by subsequently and became the model for a number of prisons throughout the world, almost identical to the concept that had been devised by Jeremy Bentham. And in many ways, also, you can see it being used in other ways, less draconian spaces, such as, for example, the CD Library in Cambridge, the History Faculty Library, loved by architects, I should say, and hated by those who had to work here. As a student, when I was translating Alberti, I was a tenant of one of the faculty of the history faculty in Cambridge, who was no lover of this building. They tried, in fact, to have it demolished, but it was preserved. But the important point about this particular building is the way that it's been laid out in a similar kind of radial way. You can see from the plan here how all the stacks, as it were, are arranged in a sense so that you can be seen by the librarian at one particular point. By the time it was built, of course, the electronic tagging system had been introduced, whereby the books, in any case, were being tagged. But the principle behind it was that you could see if anyone was going to slip a book into their pocket or something and try and steal it. The idea of surveillance, of course, has been used all over the place. In the UK, we have these, on the motorways, we have these speed cameras. And the interesting thing about the speed cameras, and certainly in the old days, is they used to warn you where there was going to be a speed camera. You had no idea whether or not there was any film in the camera or whether it was working or not. But as soon as you saw the sign, you slowed down. And in some senses, then the sign was more important than the camera itself. Of course, these days we have surveillance cameras everywhere. They're a part of how we operate, perhaps less noticeable, but nonetheless they're an essential part of existence today. So I want to sort of start off with this question: could there be an architecture of democracy? And I want to look at what architects have been thinking on this particular kind of subject. Famously, of course, Le Corbusier was well, most people are unaware of the fact that the original title proposed for Vers une architecture, towards a new architecture, the famous book by Le Corbusier, was Architecture or Revolution. The idea was that somehow that architecture could somehow prevent revolution. Somehow it had the capacity to influence social life and change. And in some senses, that idea that somehow architecture could influence people's behavior became central to kind of modernist thinking. If form follows function, then somehow somehow certain forms should in some ways anticipate or encourage a certain form of behavior in a particular building. But can architecture influence? Can it either constrain or can it open up possibilities of certain forms of democratic behavior? Over the last 50 or so years, there have been a number of kind of commentaries on this, including one by Charles Jenks and Maggie Valentine, where they look at what it's supposed to be the architecture of democracy, which is to say, this kind of example of kind of variegated gables on houses on the canals in Amsterdam. Is that going to encourage democracy? Well, according to Jenks and Valentine, it does. In some sense, it is the symbolic use, the symbolic form, it somehow encourages it. More recently, Norman Foster, who was responsible for redesigning the Reichstag, made the main chamber in the German Parliament visible through glass. In other words, you could see democracy at work as though symbolically you became part of the democratic process. But although you could see democracy at work, does this actually allow you to be part of the democratic process? Is this encouraging, in some sense, an architecture of democracy? One can equally think about many buildings in which you can see them because they're glass boxes. You can see inside them, and yet you don't have access to them unless you have certain privileged status. Either these kind of the private dwellings, or indeed one can think of maybe buildings, restaurants, bars, and so on, where you can only get access if you have, as it were, the right credit card. I wanted to turn now to some further reflections by Foucault on this kind of question. And there is this interview which I mentioned with Paul Rabinow, where Rabinow asks him again about to what extent can a building control behavior. I mean, the implication at the first reading, it's very tempting, shall we say, when reading the discussion about the Panopticon, to assume that indeed the building can influence behavior. But in this subsequent interview, in many ways, Foucault revisits this kind of question and qualifies, in some senses, his earlier statement. And it also, in some senses, reflects on a perception that many architects hold that somehow that architecture has some kind of political role, that somehow architecture can be fundamentally political. Some would argue, for example, there is a certain politics of the envelope. I'm not going to mention names here. And some would argue that if you were to position, let's say, a bath in a certain room, it is a political statement in some kind. It's a political act in itself. I would want to question, though, to what extent architecture can itself be political. That's not to say that there isn't certain politics in the way that an office operates, the kind of patriarchal values that might pervade an architectural office, or indeed in the way that the construction site operates. There are many examples throughout history. There's one example when the Karl Marx Allee was being constructed, the workers rebelled and the Russians sent in the tanks, and 12 of the workers were killed. And there are examples of, for example, there was a stadium by Zaha Hadid where a number of the construction workers were killed. Whether or not Zaha was responsible in any way for that is another question. But my point is, there is a politics of the office, there is a politics of the construction site. But the real question I want to ask is, to what extent can politics be, can a building be political, and to what extent can an architect therefore have control of the user? Sorry, I think I my thing muted there. Can I just repeat what I said? I'm sorry if I missed something there. So sorry, let me just repeat. What I want to do here is to look at the possibility of architecture controlling the behavior of the user. It's an assumption that architects have, that somehow they can design a building that will encourage or force the users to operate in a certain kind of way. And there is a discourse in architecture that would claim that architecture is in and of itself deeply political. There is a certain politics of the envelope, as some architectural commentators would say, or the fact that you could position, let's say, a bath in a certain space would make that a very political act. I would want to question that. At the same time, I'm not denying the fact there is a kind of certain politics, a certain political practice going on in the architectural office, whether it's governed by, say, patriarchal values. But I wouldn't deny the fact that on the construction site itself, there's also a certain politics of practice. And I would refer here to the case, for example, of the demonstrations that the workers held against their conditions in the building of the Karl Marx Allee in East Berlin, and the fact that the Russians sent in the tanks and 12 of the workers were killed. Likewise, I'd refer to the loss of life in one of the stadiums designed by Zaha Hadid. Not that she was responsible for it, where a number of workers are being killed. Clearly, there is a politics in terms of the practices going on, but I want to question or call into question to what extent a building can be political in and of itself, something that we will maybe pick up on a bit more next week. So, and I want to refer here to some sort of comments that were made by Foucault. And one of the comments that he makes is very, very, very straightforward. The architect doesn't control me. The architect has no power over me. If I want to tear down or change a house he built for me, put up new partitions, add a chimney, the architect has no control. And one thinks, for example, of maybe a design for a particular kind of building that maybe is used in a different sort of way. The Architectural Association in London is, of course, housed in a structure that was designed as a house initially. In fact, the whole of Bedford Square was designed as a row of houses, and now it's become a series of offices. In fact, my publishers, Bloomsbury, are located also on Bedford Square. The fact that it was designed as a house doesn't prevent it from being used in many different sort of ways. The architect has no control over that. And Foucault points to the kind of critique, as it were, of the idea that somehow an object has some kind of any particular impact. In fact, unless you subscribe to Bruno Latour's notion of actor network theory, whereby objects are part of a kind of having a role to play. In a sense, what Foucault is pointing towards is the fact that actually the politics is a practice. Liberty is a practice. I do not think that there's anything that is functionally, by its very nature, absolutely liberating. Liberty is a practice. And he refers to Le Corbusier as being somebody who has now perceived as being some sort of kind of crypto-Stalinist, but nonetheless he probably had good intentions, like many architects, and was dedicated to liberating effects, Whether or not he was able to do that is another question. As he puts it, I think that it can never be inherent in the structure of things to guarantee the exercise of freedom. The guarantee of freedom is freedom. In other words, Foucault repeats over and over again the fact that it's not up to buildings to either cause freedom or to control people. It is really to do with the practices that are taking place there. If one were to find a place, and perhaps there are some, where liberty is effectively exercised, one would find that this is not owing to the order of objects, but once again owing to the practice of liberty. Nonetheless, he points out, I think that architecture can and does produce positive effects when the liberating intentions of the architect coincide with the real practice of people in the exercise of freedom. The way that I interpret this is to say that actually the buildings could be understood in terms of their affordances. And here I want to refer to the work of James Gibson, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, where he elaborates, among other things, this idea that somehow that buildings have a certain affordance. By that I mean not that buildings have any agency, that they're able to kind of able to do anything themselves. Rather, the fact that you can use them in a certain kind of way. And some things, rather than saying they lend themselves to something, they can be used effectively for something. I mean, a knife could be used both to chop up your vegetables, but also as a murder weapon. But you wouldn't see a knife on trial for murder. It's a question of who is using it and for what. Likewise, you can think about a hammer, which is, let's say, it's good for using to bang in nails, and one could possibly imagine the possibility of using a screwdriver to bang in nails, but it wouldn't be so good. Likewise, you could imagine maybe fixing screws using a knife or some other implement, but a screwdriver would clearly be better for this. This, in a sense, is a very brief summary of the theory of affordance. The other two comments I'd make briefly about, I think, the dangers of misreading this Panopticon is, first of all, it's referred to by Foucault as an example of dispositif, which loosely translated means apparatus. And I think as architects, we tend to think about them as tools, as apparatuses, and think of them in a certain sort of way. But Foucault points out that the apparatus is a system of relations that can be established between various elements, and he refers here to the apparatus is a heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. In short, it's a question of kind of situating it in its particular discourse. The point being that the Panopticon is being used as a prison, and it affords that possibility, but it equally could be used in a different sort of way. You could imagine the Panopticon being, let's say, a nightclub or something. The second point I want to stress is that actually that Foucault describes the Panopticon as a diagram of the mechanisms of power. Now, as architects, we're used to the notion of the diagram of a building, but this is a building which becomes a diagram of the way that power is exercised. And that, I think, is importantly how Foucault perceives of the Panopticon in his discourse. So finally, let me just kind of make a comment here of an additional kind of a comment made by Gilles Deleuze in a short text, Postscript to Societies of Control, where in some senses he goes beyond that particular kind of perception, in the sense that you can see a progression from the notion of heterotopia through to the Panopticon in terms of the erosion of the hegemony of the physical, whereby the physical world doesn't control us so much as other forms of operation. Then there is a possibility of a further step. And Deleuze refers to Guattari's notion of an electronic card, which he envisions, but of course has become a reality now, which is a way that you get access to certain sort of spaces. Arguably, we've gone even further than that, in the sense that now we have other ways of accessing things based on facial recognition, and soon, no doubt, we will not need to have any keys or indeed pass cards or indeed money, because facial recognition is already being used in certain countries for purchasing certain items. And so for Deleuze, there is a shift that occurs from in a society of control where you move to a different form of operation. The factory was a body that contained its internal forces at a level of equilibrium, the highest possible in terms of production, the lowest possible in terms of wages. But in a society of control, the corporation has replaced the factory, and the corporation is a spirit, a gas. In other words, it's something that is not physical, it is in many ways invisible. And he talks about this sort of shift from the spaces of enclosure towards a different society of control. We have passed from one animal to another, from the mole to the serpent, in the system under which we live, but also in our manner of living, in our relations with others. The disciplinary man was a discontinuous producer of energy, but the man of control is undulatory, in orbit, in a continuous network. Everywhere, surfing has already replaced the older sports. I include that reference there partly because both Macapia and Behnaz are themselves avid surfers. I should add that actually I found out the reason why this was actually the case was that apparently, according to John Reichman, there was surfers became obsessed with Deleuze since Deleuze started talking about the fold, the pli. Probably a misunderstanding of Deleuze, no doubt, but nonetheless, as he kind of referred to surfers in this particular reference because of his fan club, as it were, within the world of surfing. So just to sum up, the coils of a serpent are even more complex than the burrows of a molehill. Man is no longer enclosed, but man in debt. That's an important sort of comment. The physical, the hegemony of the physical has been eroded, and now the ways in which one is controlled are no longer so much physical constraints, so much as questions such as debt. I made reference to this in an article I wrote back in 2005 about Tony Blair in London, where I was referring to precisely some of these ideas. And London, of course, was not only where Jeremy Bentham wrote the Panopticon, but it was also where George Orwell wrote 1984. And since the IRA bombings, London became the most heavily surveilled city in the world. I'm not sure whether that is still the case, but London is certainly no stranger to surveillance. What is interesting, perhaps, are the certain shifts that have happened since then. In the UK, notably, there was a moment in 1993 when a young child called Jamie Bulger was abducted and subsequently killed by two older children. And the way that they managed to catch those people was through the use of a CCTV camera from a mother care shop in a shopping mall, a shopping arcade in the UK. So in some senses, suddenly the notion of surveillance has been inherently bad was challenged by the notion that surveillance could, in some senses, protect you. And for many people, to have CCTV cameras is a source of assurance of their safety. Equally, you could take that notion that maybe Big Brother has itself been somehow inverted from the kind of the Orwellian notion of the Big Brother is watching you to the Big Brother reality TV show whereby somehow you invite the gaze. And there is a form of masquerade. You are aware that you are being watched and you develop strategies and tactics to deal with it. One can think about this maybe in terms of the strategy of the burqa. You're wearing a burqa, but underneath you can wear your Gucci underwear or whatever. The idea is that you are constantly aware that you are being watched, and yet you are playing within that system. And of course, more recently, Slavoj Žižek, among others, has commented on the fact that maybe surveillance is inherently necessary in times of COVID to be able to track those who have the virus. So it seems that attitudes towards surveillance are at least being challenged from the previous notion that surveillance was inherently bad. And above all, I want to avoid the danger of technological determinism, of assuming, in some other words, that any particular technology, any particular kind of system is either good or bad. It's really a question of how it's being used. Finally, I want to sort of comment on this notion that the idea of somehow that the glass box was somehow a sign of democracy that was opening you up in some sort of way. In this article about London, I was talking about how these glass boxes existed, all these restaurants, these trendy bars and so on. Did that mean anything else special? Did it mean that it was democratizing space in any way? And I point instead towards this, the way in which in some senses there is a form of control that's operating, an invisible form of control, a form of architecture to do with kind of credit, which in some senses defines where or not you can afford to live and so on. That, it seems to me, is in the spirit of this notion that Deleuze was talking about. is a way to understand how control it really is operating in the city today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and invite Behnaz to say a few words first of all, and then to play a video of two of her projects which take the theme of the Panopticon of surveillance and use it in a very political sort of way. Behnaz, I would say, is a critical maker. She is somebody who is a designer, but doesn't fetishize technology itself, but rather thinks about how you can use it towards a kind of critical end. Behnaz, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Neil.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
You're muted. Sorry, hold on a second.
I can hear you.
Oh, perfect.
Can you unmute her? Okay. And now, have you also need? Could you Can you share your screen?
Can you hear my voice?
We can't hear you.
I think maybe
we can't hear you.
Your speaker is off.
We can.
Okay, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Neil. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Neil mentioned, I see myself as a critical maker, in which I combine critical thinking with practical making. So I'm just having a 10 minutes video, which I would like to share, which address issues of surveillance and through the lens of the Panopticon and surveillance. So allow me to share my screen. We live in an age where we are immersed in the world of machine learning algorithms, computer vision, and biometric sensors. But what does this all mean? Might these computational systems not replicate, somewhat disturbingly, our underlying biases and serve to reinforce the marginalization of those who have typically been excluded? Is AI necessarily complicit in replicating human prejudice? Or are there ways of deploying AI as a means of exposing human bias? I would suggest that there are potential strategies that could be deployed for AI to actually overcome bias. In this presentation, I'm going to address notions of the gaze, surveillance, and ways of seeing through the lens of my own creative practice. By implementing computer vision technologies, I hope to examine how different strategies of the gaze can be seen to undermine various forms of power structure and to promote forms of resistance. Here I'm trying to avoid any form of technological determinism. Rather than rehashing arguments as to whether surveillance is good or bad, I hope to take an intersectional feminist approach to show what constitute the gaze and surveillance, and to consider what strategies of resistance might be proved to be effective in art and design practices. Here I hope to address two questions related to the notion of the gaze. Firstly, what does it mean to be observed? Secondly, what do we see when we look out at the world? Through my argument, I use gaze as an interchangeable concept which could be shared between human and machine. This takes us to the historical concept of Panopticon. The Panopticon refers to a type of institutional building and a system of control envisioned by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. The layout of the Panopticon allows a guard to observe occupants without them knowing whether or not they're being watched. French philosopher Michel Foucault revitalizes interest in the Panopticon in his 1975 book Discipline and Punish, and uses it to illustrate such a model could be applied to disciplinary societies in order to control their citizens. He described the prisoner of a Panopticon as being at the receiving end of asymmetrical surveillance. As a consequence, the inmate polices himself for fear of punishment. What is fascinating about this example is that rather than external actions, the gaze of the watcher is internalized to such an extent that each prisoner becomes his or her own watch person. Similarly, we could argue that this is what allows rules and regulation to be internalized so as to inform our actions, behaviors, and even our beliefs. Moreover, the manner in which we naturalize and internalize rules, it could be claimed, causes society to be less willing to contest unjust laws and accept a dominant outlook. Similar to how the inmates are not aware whether or not they're being watched, we are not aware that we have been controlled through naturalized dominant rules rooted in our own culture. This internalized asymmetrical power structure could be seen in the notion of male gaze. In her essay on visual pleasure and narrative cinema, Laura Mulvey exposes the asymmetry of social and political power relations between men and women. Mulvey claims that the male gaze serves to depict women as the object of pleasure for the heterosexual male viewer. Besides the fact that women are regularly subject to sexual harassment whenever they enter public space through various forms of looked-atness, women have absorbed all this unconsciously as a form of internalized male gaze. What if women were to subvert this through the power of their gaze? Could we draw upon computer vision technologies to allow women to know when onlookers are staring at them? Augmented with facial and gaze tracking technology and smart materials, this cape responds to the onlooker's gaze. The project engages with broader social issues such as the male gaze on the female body. The facial tracking algorithm in this piece detects age, gender, and gaze of the onlooker. While we know that gender is performative and it doesn't depend on pure representation, the movement of the garment based on the viewer's gaze could unfold in new sets of social meanings. If you are the wearer, you know which part of your body is being looked at, and if you are an onlooker, you know that your action is being noticed. The aim is to see how different strategies could be used to undermine the patriarchal system by developing a form of resistance using surveillance technology. This project is inspired by the historical mask worn by Bandari women from southern Iran. It has been said that these masks were developed during Portuguese colonial rule as a way of protecting the wearer from the gaze of a slave master looking for pretty women. From these Iranian masks protecting women from the patriarchal oppression, to masks of Northwest Coast Indians, to masks worn as political statements, masks take on a range of different religious, social, and political roles, and offer an interesting insight into how we could use them to either conceal or reveal our identities. While these Iranian masks cover most of the wearer's face except the eye, I've been wondering how the eyes could be used as an expressive medium for communication. In my research, I came across an interesting incident in which an American officer uses blinking to send a secret message. In this video, you're seeing Admiral Jeremy Bentham blinking the word torture using Morse code during his captivity in Vietnam. The use of code for communication is nothing new, and in fact, women came up with a code word as a method for reporting domestic abuse during this lockdown. In this project, I was particularly inspired by a recent experiment involving 2 AI bots at the Facebook AI lab. The intention was to monitor how 2 bots might develop a dialogue. However, during this experiment, the bots seemingly started to formulate their own language, a language that no human could understand. The researchers had to intervene and tweak the algorithms to prevent this from happening. The story could also reveal how knowledge is power, and inability to understand unnerves those who wish to maintain their authority. For the source text of this project, I used the seminal article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, by the feminist theorist Gayatri Spivak. She asked whether it might be possible for the colonized, or the subaltern, to have a voice in the face of colonial oppression. Using machine learning algorithm, we can use Markov chain to create a text. We represent each word as a state and view transitions as the likelihood that a specific word might go after another. We can consider these states at either a word or character level. And we can analyze what the probability might be of a given letter appearing after 3 letters. The engrams of a given text provides a strategy for generating the next text. The Markov chain could be therefore used to generate text where each new letter is dependent upon the previous letters. As the mass communicates using BLE protocol, the algorithm is repeated and the engrams changes. The smaller the engram gets, the less meaning there is in the generated text from the linguistic perspective. Each letter generated through this process is translated into Morse code, which informs the movement of the actuators. In the video documentation of this project, which will be shown shortly, you will see 2 women wearing masks, covered with eyelashes controlled by AI. They begin to communicate with each other, blinking their eyelashes in rapid succession. The aim is to develop a secret message for transmitting information between multiple women. The project brings together design, critical thinking, feminism, and AI. Winston Churchill once said, "We shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us." But doesn't this suggest a form of technological determinism? After all, there is no inherent application for any tool. A knife could be used as a murder weapon or just as a tool for cutting an apple. Similar arguments could be made about surveillance. The question we should ask are, in what context, how, and for whom are we using it? We should be aware of potential problems with AI. For once an issue is recognized as problem, it becomes a different kind of problem. It becomes a problem not by which we are trapped, but rather with which we can deal. Bias is certainly a problem which originates from human beings and is replicated and even exacerbated in AI. As we are training the artificial algorithms to learn to see the world, it is important to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be seen by the machine? And through the lens of what kind of data are they trained to look out to the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Behnaz. That was exquisitely beautiful. Let's move. I have questions afterwards and just move straight on to Peter. And then we can discuss things. Peter, over to you. You're muted. You are muted, definitely.
No, how's that?
Yeah, better. Great, thanks.
Okay, I have a few things to show about my work, and then maybe I'll make a few comments about the way the research is framed around some of the problems that I developed in my reading of Foucault. Actually, it's interesting, Neil, the clip you played, it was the first time I've heard Foucault's voice. I've never watched the videos of him. I have never listened to the lectures. And although I have a number of his works, his biographies, and this would be very different than Sanford's take, I'm certain. I don't actually think of Foucault so much as a person in that biographical sense. And I'm always curious to hear the anecdotes and the stories. So Sanford will be good company. But I think my reticence is actually, I'm really interested in the kinds of research that are performed and how they, let's say, allow for different ways of understanding relationships. So the first thing I'm going to show you is an architectural project, but it's actually based in film. And it was a performance for the storefront for art and architecture a number of years ago.
Can I just check you're able to share?
Yeah, I am.
You are, okay.
Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, and now I'll share another thing quickly. And this is a book I've been working on related to an exhibition a couple of years ago at HDLU in Zagreb in Croatia. Just briefly, as I scroll through it, it was actually, the title was taken from the first series of Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France, in which the word distributions is a really important feature of his study of ancient Greek institutions and their manifestation in the city, and the acknowledgement in a way that the birth of the city in Western civilization is simultaneously developed with the birth of institutions that include new legal reforms, economic and monetary transformations, and definitely the function of law with respect to political power. So for me, the exhibition was a way of exploring some of the aspects of that first series of lectures that he gave, and I think 1970 and 71, but I think also which guides a lot of the work that he develops and ultimately defines his interest in the problem of truth and the problem of justice. So although this is related in a sense to the inspiration I had from the text, ultimately the idea was never to kind of return to Foucault, but look for, in my interest in both art and architecture, the problems of power and its relationship to space. So the installation proceeded, this is the building, proceeded as a series of sculptural installations in the main rotunda. It's kind of like a bit of a circular Bramante's Tempietto, for example. And you can see Foucault does make an appearance. And the sculpture at the front, where the entrance is actually based on contrapposto. So this will lead into the next thing I'm about to show you. In a way, it documents the exhibition in terms, this is another artist, Paulo Surya, who uses Google Maps and kind of takes the instances of people and then reinstalls them in the sites for Google Images. These, of course, obviously relate to a certain historical understanding of Greek architecture and sculpture. But ultimately, and here, of course, is Karl Marx. He's working with a young woman who's holding a Rorschach book. So there's some other features. Okay, the last thing that I want to show you is another project related to these issues, but in a way, a bit more simplistic in terms of its content. And here I've just put together some slides more in the mode of an art history lecture than something else, I think. Okay. So one thing, that students of art history will know when it's a question of the history of Western art and Western civilization, and there's a lot of, of course, conflict with the question of where it sits with respect to the ancient Near East and the legacy of Egyptian art or pharaonic art. But one of the typical understandings of ancient Greek art is that there is this moment between the 6th and the 5th century, this kind of explosion. And the work had been developing both in philosophy and in art over centuries, maybe one or two. And then there's this radical transformation, which is called the classical period. And it's a moment in which you could probably call it both realism and naturalism, but it was the idea that the artist somehow was connecting with reality in a direct way, that there was this possibility of understanding the way in which things really are, how the body behaves what it is like to be in this time and space, in the hic et nunc, in the here and now. And then, of course, this deeply contrasts with the forms of symmetry and the kind of static features of, let's say, Egyptian statuary. So there's simultaneously then this notion that a kind of freedom emerges with this discovery, this perceptual connection, this epistemological connection with reality. And of course, this is also the same time we see the great flourishing of Socrates, Plato, and then later Aristotle. So if I look at some of these things, though, from if you want to call it a Foucauldian perspective, but that's a bit limiting. Let's say from the perspective of question of genealogy or history, and a way of narrowing that focus a bit, not so much on the grand picture, but on very small things. And it's a project that I'm working on in architecture as well, which has to do with the transformation of the line over the last few centuries. If we look quickly, so here's an example in Euthymedes, the three revelers. This would be a kind of proto-classical, but just around the cusp of the archaic to the classical transformation. And here you see the way the line defines movement, the fabric of the body, and the body takes on all these kind of animated features. If we look back at the history of vase production and painting and the function of the line, one would recognize, of course, kind of complete transformation of very primitive, somewhat kind of thick graphic gestures. So the warrior vase from Mycenae, a previous civilization, but getting closer to ancient Greece. In the 8th century, geometric crater from the Dipylon Cemetery, in which it's a kind of funereal procession of a hero, horses. And a geometric refers to both the kind of character of the line work and the graphics, but also the way in which bodies and the events are described. Then there's a period of the Orientalizing period, which really has to do with the kind of commerce and transformation of practices based on influences from the ancient Near East, as well as stylistic motifs based on animals. And this becomes encoded as we kind of move into the 6th century. And you see now the figures and their relationship to each other and the space of the surface of the vase take on a quality of a narration. And this is a kind of panoply of references to the Olympic gods and a whole series of events, including a wild boar chase. Then about half a century later, we start to see a kind of animation and a detail. And if you look at Ezekias's the kylix, if you look at the sail, you'll notice the way it is billowing, on how, although the line that is still defining primarily the characters is black figure, which means that the line is incised across that surface, that glazing. The line that defines the sail actually is taking on a very different performance. So all of a sudden, we begin to see in red figure ceramic production, the line begins to animate the interior of the body differently, the face differently, the relationships between the characters differently. And just to give that contrast again, there's this opening up of the event that's happening in the depiction of the characters. And so previously, more in the archaic period and before then, an event was described in somewhat abstract, rudimentary terms, but now it takes on the moment of a kind of livid connection with the observer. And similar things happen, of course, in sculpture. Well, it turns out that during this period, there were a number of transformations in ancient Greece, and of course, Athens is one of the main centers of these transformations. It happens in different ways in different Greek city-states. But the point is that the kind of political and legal reforms that happened at the end of the 6th century, and which, or at the end of, let's say, the 7th century by Solon, and it's carried on in the 6th century, ultimately created a transformation and development of the Greek polis. And they were initially based on class strife. That is to say, debt slavery. And Solon's role in this was to ameliorate the conflict between the land-owning aristocracy, the political leaders and the elite, and citizens who had kind of worked themselves into debt and also slavery. So essentially, it was a way of holding off civil war. But in the transformation of power, some of the things that happened were political rights and legal rights were now based on income, not so much the owning of property. So it seemed to distribute in a more even fashion political rights. Simultaneously, a kind of economic shift in the use of money or the creation of money-like elements allowed one to kind of participate differently economically. And then finally, the transformation of the legal system from the archaic to the classical period involved a kind of transformation of the knowledge of the event of the crime in relationship to the gods and in relationship to a judgment that by the classical period had become a kind of development of the notion of witness who had seen the event, who had some kind of capacity to recall because the witness was there. And if you know anything about Athenian legal culture during the 5th century, it exploded with litigation. And there would be juries sometimes of up to 4,000 or 5,000 citizens casting votes. So the question, I mean, for me, that becomes interesting from the point of view of Foucault's work is the way in which what seemed like a natural organization, a natural system, a natural discovery could easily be tied into a number of other social transformations, a number of epistemological transformations, where the notion of truth and event and fact, which had gained a certain kind of development over the period of a century and a half, and changed the idea of a legal performance into the notion of a witness, is parallel then with the kind of transformation of the way in which art functioned by virtue of the technical features of line. And that is to say that the line is a kind of interesting place to begin to discuss a problem of distribution, where the line begins to reside, how it acts, what it opens up. And these would also be called technologies. So in the technological or apparatus of governmentality and institutions in ancient Athens, there is simultaneously this kind of cultural and aesthetic one, but it's often assumed that there's a kind of difference, that there's a discovery in art. Whereas in fact, one could begin to see it as a simultaneous transformation of a certain kind of technique. So there you have it. That's my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Let's open up to questions. We have Sanford here. I'm hoping that Sanford can add some reflections as someone who attended some of Foucault's lectures in Paris all those years ago, to bring alive, in some senses,
before my time.
Before your time. So I mean, I'm surprised. Yeah, it was. I think to hear Foucault was kind of interesting, and it's such a shame that we have a lot of his lectures, but they're all audio recordings only, and to bring him alive. But Sanford, I don't know if you want to offer any comments at this stage.
Well, let me just say a few disclaimers anyway, just because I think the conversation is going to go now to places that I feel I'm going to learn a great deal, rather than have to listen to myself. And I would like to first say, I don't really feel fully comfortable providing anecdotes and gossip, especially not in a recorded and live streamed session. I would hate for that to go down as my contribution to the contemporary assessment, shall I say, one of the contemporary assessments of the philosopher who probably had the greatest impact on my life. And, you know, that's it. My life's done in that sense. There's not going to be another. So that's number one. The one other thing I want to say as a way of stepping out of the conversation for a moment is that I found Niels, your introduction to a couple of things I want to say about it is, first of all, it constructed, to use that word. I hate that word. I do my best always to avoid that word, but nonetheless, it presented a Foucault that is very, very familiar to me, but one that is no longer familiar or active in a way that probably maybe Neil still feels it is or even ought to be. I'm kind of broken on that front. I don't feel like that particular Foucault is around anymore. And I lament it. But I just want to say that I recognized in it now I would like to also say, before I go on any more about that, I will say that the work that Peter is doing, I know only from a distance, I find it totally fascinating. I'll tell you why. Number one, because he's not connected actually to the historical context or even the geographical context of it, but he is intensely engaged in this stuff. Secondly, because he's dealing with the very, very late work of Foucault, which is one that I personally had great difficulty actually in engaging with or even understanding. Foucault made a number of changes. It was during the time when I actually knew him, but I was talking to him about shit that he must have like rolled his eyes all the time. Says, what the fuck is this kid going on about? I left that stuff behind a long time ago. He was obviously very interested in the classical world at that time, and he was also beginning to engage 20th century Germans, and I found that also weirdly strange in a way. And I would like to say that I believe that some of it had to do with Foucault's, shall we say, his repressed but nonetheless present sense of, I think, mortality. And what I mean is this: is I sort of think, as my thought, Foucault knew he was dying without actually wishing to admit it even to himself. And I feel that that in Foucault's late work, I don't know what Peter will think about this. I feel like in his late work, there was a kind of late, if you like, consideration of the foundational. I thought he felt very drawn to Greece in a way because it was the source. And I felt like he had taken on a whole set of topics which he would have rejected as the sort of iconoclast of the 1960s and 70s. Anyway, I just wondered what you guys all think about that. Secondly, I would like to finally say this: is that I recognize in a lot of the work today, including in Behnaz's thing, is what I consider is an outcome of the Americanized Foucault. I studied with Foucault in France for a number of years, and then I moved to the United States, actually for the first time, because I'm Canadian, to study, in New York City at Columbia University. And, there were reasons why I went there. And I would just like to split this for everybody, because it's number one, there was a lot of work being done in this area, and I would say much more closely in the area that Neil laid out, which was being done in the French department at Columbia, and specifically around the seminars and the work, and especially the publications of Sylvain L'Autringer and the whole semiotext project, which was really still in its incipient days when I got to New York. And that was a very different and for me, a very more realistic Foucault than the one that was happening over in Comp Lit, which is where I was, and in English, which was largely around Said. Now, I know that generations have taken their lead from Said, and I would say that I was supposed to be doing my doctorate, if you like, with Said. And I would say that the break with me and Said, which is not interesting to anybody, but I'm not going to tell anecdotes about it, but really had to do with the fact that it became increasingly clear to me that his Foucault was not one either that I agreed with, nor was it one that I found accurate. In fact, I found it ultimately fairly destructive. And I would just say one should basically understand that kind of that development in the Anglo-Saxon world was one in which you could see it playing out for those of you who are interested, you could see it playing out in that remarkable television show that only recently got dropped onto YouTube, which is this famous lecture, which I have to tell you, you know, there was not lecture, but a famous television show that brought Foucault and Chomsky together. And when I was a student in Paris, and I was super young, by the way, this stuff, like once I saw it, my hair caught fire, and I dropped out of school and I headed over to Paris, and I said, one way or the other, you know, I did that twice or maybe 3 times in my life, and those were extraordinary. Those were like transformative experiences for me. But what I want to say is I always heard about the Chomsky Foucault debate. A lot of my friends in Paris, you know, would talk about it, would mention it, would be invoked. And I had to wait 30 years to finally see it. And when I saw it, I couldn't help, I was laughing my head off. And anyway, I recommend you all look at it. I think there's subtitles now. Yeah, of course, it had to be in English because Chomsky was speaking English. But anyway, I can't even remember what language it was in. I suggest you guys look at it because you will see a very early confrontation in worldviews. But these worldviews, especially to someone like me who was shaped around this, I was super attuned, if you like, to the underlying methodological principles, if you like. That's to say, we are looking at 2 entirely different approaches to what is understood to be that which underlies the appearance of reality. Foucault had his own set of understandings, even though they were very much the same. You know, Chomsky's deep structure and Chomsky's ultimately sort of, I would have to say, one-dimensional Marxist understanding of let's say, the social deep grammars that condition the actual physical organization of our world in terms of its, you know, power structures, institutions, et cetera, and then Foucault's. It's an extraordinary encounter, but one can see there, I think, for me anyway, in an incredibly clear way, just what the nature and structure of the bifurcation actually is. Okay, I want to say one third thing, because I knew, you know, first of all, you guys should know I did not prepare for this. However, I knew that just listening to this work, I would be, you know, I'd have a million things to say. I would like to say this as well. In the early days when I got to New York, well, I don't know how to say this. Okay, so anyone who wants to really get a grasp, at least of the Foucault that, you know, that I recognize and that I would say our generation recognized. And by the way, I wasn't the only North American, so to speak, in Paris during those specific years. I will cite one. I met Brian Masumi, for example, in a lecture of Foucault. You know, he was sitting on the opposite side of the room, and eventually, of course, we found each other. But, you know, there were also a bunch of students. There were a lot of students who were in Paris at the time, some studying with Barthes, some with Derrida, and so on and so forth. Now, I have to say, there was a very powerful wall between those who were, you know, attending Derrida's seminars and even Barthes and Foucault's. And anyway, I would like to say that really is that it was curious. Look, I remember when Said came to came to Paris. I'll give you one example. I remember when he came to Paris, and this is really a piece of gossip, and I'm probably not going to be proud that I told this, but I was struck by it. Said came to Paris before I went to Columbia. You know, I wanted to meet with him because I wanted to discuss going to Columbia and working with him. And I asked him if he wanted me to save him a seat for Foucault's lecture that was happening that Wednesday morning. And he said, sure, okay. And because you had to get there really early if you wanted a seat. So, you know, I got there, et cetera, you know, and Said turns up. And I noticed as I was sitting next to him, as he was listening to the lecture, he was squirming. I mean, he was fucking squirming. He could barely stand still. I said, Jesus Christ, does this guy have like some kind of ADD? Like, what the hell is going on here? And I remember after the talk, he said that he was so repulsed, he could barely sit still. I'm going to leave that one with you as such. I mean, I have lots of reflections on that. Obviously, I had years of engagement. with him and with that on particularly on the subject of Foucault. But it was a fascinating experience, shall we say, with the way, if you like, with a kind of a tradition of study and a tradition of engagement with, shall we say, thought. I mean, nobody was more, shall we say, comfortable in reading French scholarship, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, one thing that became incredibly clear to me were the deforming biases, which I later, of course, found far more out about, once I moved to New York and was living there. And the final thing I wanted to say is that when people ask me exactly, how would we come to understand the broader, deeper context of Foucault's thought, I used to tell them, because when I was doing Zone, especially when I was doing Zone 6 in corporations, I called up this guy in New York that many will know named Jim Miller. Jim Miller was doing a biography of Foucault. Now, there's many biographies of Foucault now. There's at least 4. But Miller's was pretty much the first, certainly the first that came out. It came up before Didier Eribon's came out. And I knew Didier Eribon, I knew what his biases would be, actually. But James Miller, I was trying to get him to write a piece for our book, Zone 6 in Corporations. And he sent me the manuscript of his book, which I read. And I have to tell you, I've rarely read a book that was so, it was so moving, it was so disturbing in its ability to seize the kernel and to reinvoke the richness and the nuances. And actually, it was spooky, the specter of the context in which Foucault was working in the years in which it was known to me. And the fascinating thing about it is that Miller never met Foucault. He never studied in France. He never lived in France. He didn't know any of this. He got it all. The guy is gifted beyond belief. He got it all from his research and from his conversations with people. Anyway, I do tell people, have a look at that book if you want to understand the real underlying, and I would have to call it the underlying darkness behind Foucault's ideas and what their coherence was, and to understand the underlying Dionysian/Nietzschean aspects of Foucault's thought, because Foucault's thought, especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries, has been completely deformed by so-called post-Freudian and post-Marxist readings. In fact, Foucault's thought, and I'm going to say this for the last time in my life, I think, is that that is fundamentally to misunderstand Foucault's thought, that Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, in fact, possibly preeminently Nietzsche, lay behind Foucault's thought. And I think that's something Macapia will certainly understand, because in the work that he is doing now, he has to have encountered some of that early Nietzschean classicism, if you like, as remnants of his thought. But I would like to say finally, yes, one last thing is that a lot of people forget that Foucault spent years, during the years I knew him, he was working on it. He used to talk about it as well. He spent years overseeing the complete encyclopedic archiving and republishing of all of the work of Georges Bataille. And I would have to say that for me, Foucault is a Bataillean thinker. And that is something I never actually discovered in any of the so-called Foucauldian or post-Foucauldian Foucauldians in the Anglo-Saxon world. Let me leave it at that. I spoke too long.
No, Sanford, that was amazing. And please don't hesitate to jump in. I think to get those kind of insights are really absolutely crucial. I didn't know that there was this kind of thing going on between Said and Foucault, for sure. just one kind of question. I think, in a way, what is so interesting about Canadians, about yourself and Brian, is that you guys are bilingual. You can speak French. And I think this is a kind of like a bridge across the Atlantic that in many ways is kind of crucial. And in many ways, what you were saying, certainly in the UK, it was French departments. People like Jeff Bennington, for example, the University of Sussex, who at the time, until they closed the French department, who are really pushing continental philosophy in many ways. And I think that capacity to engage linguistically with these, this kind of way of thinking was crucial. So I'm surprised that Saeed could speak French, but maybe he's from Lebanon, right? And they speak French there. But that seems to be the crucial kind of question. Can I just ask you one question, Sanford? You spoke about two different sort of kind of shifts in a way, a shift from the old understanding of Foucault to the new understanding, and you spoke about the French and the American way. Are you saying that the American way is a kind of like the later version? Is that what you're trying to characterize?
Oh boy, this is a complicated question. Look, you know what I've done? I've opened a Pandora's box here. Why? Because I haven't, I tell you the truth, I haven't really even read Foucault in well over a decade. And I certainly haven't, there are so many major movements of thought, especially in the university, that consider themselves Foucauldian or Foucault inspired today. Honestly, I keep my distance from them. And I want everyone to know that that's just a massive bias of my own. And the problem with it is that, I have way too much attitude about it. So I'm going to try to keep that to myself. I will say that there are many, many breaks or bifurcations, etc. Now, there are of two types. Number one are the bona fide ones which can be identified in Foucault's own thinking. But as a subtext on that, there's also Foucault's own encounter with Americans whom he loved, frankly, in many ways. And he loved coming to the United States. And for him, the United States was just one of his everybody, people who know Foucault's history know him very well. Foucault left France. Oh my God, I could tell you guys anecdotes. More are coming to my head right now. Insanely funny ones. I'm going to tell one because this is one that was widely shared in Paris among a certain group. But let me go back. First of all, Foucault left France. He was an incredibly, shall we say, tortured, actually. He was an incredibly tortured young man. And he needed to get the hell out of France, especially in order to better able to live his sexuality. He spent years in Sweden, where he felt immensely free or emancipated from the oppressive French Moors. He spent years in Brazil, teaching. He, obviously went to Iran as well. He was very, very interested in Iran, and he got himself massively damaged, his reputation massively damaged. Some will remember, I'm sure that Behnaz will remember, when he attempted to, in some ways, provide an apologia for the Islamicist regime in the early years of the Islamicist regime in Iran. But nonetheless, there was the vacations in Morocco. Anyway, Foucault was always looking for and absolutely needing that kind of cultural transposition. He had to get the hell out. He had to live in a different context in order to think. Now, I have to say, this is a very important thing that was important when I referred to the Dionysian, the Bataillean Foucault, which is the body Foucault, really. And this is something that is largely lost, I think, in contemporary, shall we say, academic approaches to Foucault. But that was a very important thing. I do want to tell the little anecdote because everybody's going to find it fascinating, because I heard it from many people, especially Foucault's boyfriends, actually, because Foucault had two pretty well-known ones. One was d'Enfer, who used to turn up at the lectures as well and used to hang out at lunch, et cetera, et cetera. And there was another young boy who wrote who I met at the Bibliothèque Nationale, actually. Foucault introduced us, but a strange kid, blonde-headed kid who, of course, died of AIDS soon after, and who wrote a famous book about Foucault called The Man Who Did Not Save My Life, or something, L'homme qui ne m'a pas sauvé la vie. In any case, the stories that would be told is when Foucault was at the École Normale Supérieure is the school where the elite French students go in order to become leaders, if you like. But it's one of the 5 schools that are to breed an elite of French leadership. And the intellectuals, in the humanities, they go to the École Normale. And the École Normale, even if it's in Paris, the kids live there, basically. It's a kind of like a boarding school. And, everybody went there. Pretty much, at least for generations, everybody who was anybody probably went to the École Normale. When Foucault was there, it was said Foucault used to go from room to room in the dorms, and he used to interview the other students and ask them about their sex lives. Just ask them to tell stories about their sex lives. Now, the reason that is so funny is because during the years during which I would hear that story were during the years when Foucault was going on and on about the compulsion to speak, or the compulsion to self-identify, if you like, which of course he always said is these things, the greatest oppression is to force these things not only into speech, but into public discourse. That is to say that these are things that ought to remain within the density, shall we say, of experience and the body. These are things that need to stay, if you like, in the shadows. And of course, this idea today that everybody is trying to bring everything out into the light without the slightest appreciation, if you like, for the dense matrix, the dense mycorrhizal, you could almost say, mycorrhizal matrix to which these things are connected somatically, psychically, historically, and so on and so forth. Anyway, you're getting a sense of what some of my things are. And in any case, for Foucault, there was always an erotic component to virtually everything he did. And there is, I could go on and on about that in many ways. And there's the obvious stories, but they don't mean anything because it's much, much deeper than that. I'd be interested to hear actually what both Peter and Behnaz think about that. I'll just stop.
About what? About the
erotic component to virtually every aspect of his work.
Well, I don't know, Behnaz, what you think. There's one thing, Behnaz, I just wanted to speak to you a bit about your presentation, which I found was really fascinating, and the evolution, let's say, of the optical element of society and how it functions politically. One thing it's worth, because actually Spivak was a professor of mine at Columbia, and I studied Derrida's work with her. And the text that you refer to, it's an interesting text because she explicitly, well, let's not say denounces, but confronts Deleuze and Foucault with the kind of European epistemological arrangement from which they work to identify, features of liberating the subject. So I think that's one thing. And also Foucault's really been reconsidered on many fronts with respect to, it's fair in a sense, it's also problematic, but I think he's been confronted in many ways with regard to his lack of discussion of other geographies. But okay, fine, but still, I think there's a lot there. And I'm interested because that text that Spivak wrote is so dense. And I think I appreciate it because it comes, also out of poetry and literature and not just the academic world. And one thing that I remember her saying to us at one point was the problem, and I think this is something that both Derrida and Foucault share, which is a relationship to literature that most philosophers don't have. And Sanford would have a lot more to say about that for sure, and poetry. maybe poetry more so of Derrida. But for Spivak, one of the things that I always remember her saying was the way in which theory and knowledge can make you really muscle bound, in a sense that it's actually hard to move. It's hard to think around these issues when you're so kind of stifled, when the body in a way is so stifled with knowledge in that sense. And I think that text that you refer to is one that really is as important to study as, let's say, the Panopticon. That if one really wanted today to rethink Foucault's work, it wouldn't be necessarily against Foucault, but it would be against the kind of banal tradition that has been made out of the Panopticon. And I think that Sanford rightly points out that Neil, your lecture is really, it captures a moment, and there's a kind of like, there's a sense that moment's lost. It's no longer politically relevant, which doesn't mean it shouldn't be counted, but I think the political relevance right now has to confront Foucault in different ways. And Spivak's text, which Behnaz, you brought up, I think is a really important way of doing that and kind of working through. And then I kind of wanted to refer to something, you just said, Sanford, about the body. This question, I think it's hard to understand this question of the corporeality. But when you read his earlier work, because it seems like it's always something that's imposed upon if you only pay attention to Madness and Civilization, Birth of the Clinic, Discipline and Punish, and these kind of, and the history of sexuality. The canonical works really show power functioning in one direction. And I think Foucault, in going back to Greece, discovered this two-way, a lot more interesting, intensive transit between power and agency. And I think as he got to the end of his life and the end of his lectures, he had to find a way to kind of confront, in a sense, this, what is your relationship to, what's one relationship to, he went through this whole phase about governmentality, but he brought it back to the studies of ancient Greece that had to do with, like, what is the possibility of independent thinking? And I think the care of the self, the theme of the care of the self that he got from Plato and Socrates, which is both erotic, it was both physical, it was medical, it was spiritual, it was an intersection of all these things, these practices, to go back to Neil's earlier point, that the guarantee of freedom is the practice of freedom. There isn't anything that gives you freedom. Nothing holds it in abeyance. It's just a practice. But I think what I appreciate about the way his work progressed through this series of lectures at the Collège de France was I think he really desired to earn a place in the history of philosophers by having to go back through the Greek work, and especially the interpretations of Socrates. And there's a lot of controversy about his work on that, but also the plays of Euripides. But I think in the end, when you mentioned that he had a sense that he was dying, I think that there was that kind of urgency in the work, but it had to do with accepting the body beyond just those intersections, and it was the question of death. And that was another really interesting feature of his work, this question of, like, what is mortality in relationship to all these other features. And I think there's one thing that I would say, if one wanted to study Foucault in the contemporary world and ask themselves, like, well, how could I use Foucault? Obviously, there are a million different ways you can do it. But one of the things that I keep thinking about is the problem, and I don't want to cast it into the political realm of, like, Trump or post-Trump, but the function of truth. And if you had to ask yourself, is truth that which liberates you, or is it that which constrains you? I think this is a consistent problem across all of Foucault's work. And I think that doesn't have an answer. It's a field of work that one has to do again and again historically in order to kind of define the political reality that one lives in, not to come to some metaphysical principle, but to be able to really understand the details and the features of one's own kind of political life.
Peter, that's a brilliant division. I just want to ask you this as you keep going, please. So is it fair to say, just as a working hypothesis, that a way of just thinking about what I earlier said is it somewhat safe to say, or at least is it instructive to think what you just said, and that is this way, is that I would almost say the true Foucauldian thing, the true Foucauldian axis is to assume that truth is what oppresses you, or at least that participation in the truth project is that which oppresses you. Whereas in the Anglo-Saxon, or let's just say in the non-Latin, non-Nietzschean, non-Bataillean, sort of deformed, as I would say, Foucault, it's the opposite, that it is the marriage of the puritanical belief that truth liberates.
You can see that coming from a mile away since the late 19th century and the bifurcation of Husserl and even Heidegger. After Husserl, when you go in the Anglo-American tradition, it's really about logic. And that's where, people like Ayer and Russell and then Wittgenstein developed truth functions. And when you read Anglo-American philosophy, it's actually almost juridical in its discursive nature.
I'm also talking about the social. I mean, it would be hard to say that, people like Quine and Ayer were dominant, in any way in the American, book production system or in the American Academy. But you would say I would say, well, that just reflects the way the Anglo-Saxon world looks at reality. And there is a much deeper, it's much more, there's a much deeper cultural, underlying cultural division, which I have to say is being lost as globalization has now, homogenized so much for us over the last just the last 2 decades, where we're already losing. I see the French as losing connection, if you like, to their very, very deep roots. And I have to say again, I'm going to say it one more time. The Jim Miller book is positively uncanny how, at least for me anyway, how it was able to invoke a completely different universe.
Yeah. Well, Behnaz, your work, I think, just to bring this up really quick, it points to this question. I think that the Anglo-American philosophy developed out of a very legal kind of, discursive accent, if you will. It's just super different than the continental European tradition. But Behnaz, as you're working through, decolonizing and reframing a lot of these discourses away from a certain Eurocentric tradition, which I think that's one of the more important questions that's, confronting academic work, especially in North America. But, I would assume that for you, there is this question of how one raises the question of the subject, in the context of the work that you're doing, which could not, it can't really remain tied to that European circle of philosophy. I mean, how do you see that in terms of, Islamic authors or even Islamic legal tradition?
I mean, thank you so much, Peter, for the great question, and thank you, Sanford, for all your remarks. I've learned a ton today, so thank you both. I think in the context of Foucault and then Spivak, or actually, in fact, Edward Said, which I'm extremely inspired by his work and the Orientalism, which really take the notion of discourse and power structure to talk about Orientalism. I think it's very, very fascinating and inspiring for me as someone coming from the same area of the world. And exactly to your point, Peter, I'm fascinated by ways that we can bring this global and local, center and periphery together and actually talk about subject not from Euro-American perspective, but from non-Western perspective, to see how we could actually address the subject. But it's not, which is grounded in certain socio-economic gender identity. So I'm really fascinated by the way that you can bring Foucault, but give it this sort of intersectional approach to bring all these facets of information to study the subject. I left kind of thinking about Sanford comments about Edward Said. What is it that it bothered you about how Said adopted Foucault in his discourse? Because to me, as an outsider who is learning about these, is that it just gave it a kind of a different edge by the thing that Foucault was never really addressing this non-Western perspective. He actually brought this in the sort of studying how the power structure plays, especially in context of post-colonial studies. Yeah, I'm really curious to actually learn more about that.
I'm not altogether either prepared or willing in a public realm and in a spontaneous way to fully address that. I haven't thought about it really as such in a very long time, but let me say a few things because I remember it as it slowly developed. The first thing, of course, was the power, let's say, of the homophobia, which for me, in a way, was already a trigger. It was already a trigger and a sign, if you like, of a fundamental need, I would say, that that Said had in a way to filter Foucauldianism, shall we say. I also don't believe that Orientalism is a Foucauldian book. I think that it is a deformation of Foucauldian thought for the main reason that it flattens the concept of the epistemological as if it were merely a case and a routine return of the ideological. I think that ultimately Orientalism is a work of criticism and not a work of philosophy, but it really, you could say it's extraordinarily creative. And in fact, it was immensely, as you know very well, I mean, it was immensely influential. But again, it's not Foucault, it's not Foucauldian for a whole variety of reasons. On the other hand, is that just my bias in terms, look, one could isolate a number of breaks as is in Foucault. And there was the epistemological period, the first Foucauldian phase that probably ends with the Archaeology of Knowledge, which, by the way, is a massively underread book and a damn difficult book to read today because of how saturated it is with the jargon and with the intensity of the conversation that was happening specifically in Paris during that decade, which has to do with the methodological stuff and the philosophical stuff. Nobody has really no young students today have a grasp, if you like, over all the nuances of all the Macapia, in a way, may very well, because one of the most interesting things, even though maybe Macapia, because of his training, wasn't as steeped in the underlying linguistics, certainly what Foucault does in that book, in a way that it would be available, very clearly available to someone like Macapia, is Foucault begins to migrate the French Saussurean and semiotic obsession over into the British, what they call the ordinary language philosophers, over into the British pragmatic tradition. And this pragmatics as defined, let's say, in the continent, as opposed to the way it was defined, let's say, in England. This pragmatics is a very, very important component, I would say, of Foucault's thought, widely missed in the sense that it was interpreted as basically just being a redux of the familiar British pragmatics. In fact, it was a very, very astute reading. And I have to say that it was thanks in many ways to Deleuze, that became clear to a certain generation of ours. And that was because Deleuze was also feeling the same need, if you like, to incorporate the best and most powerful aspects of British thought. And in that case, it was, it was through Danish philosophers like Helmsliev, in which they discovered, let's say, bridges to the ways in which the ordinary language philosophers in Britain understood language use. And that was basically to say that language use would not be a signifying process, would not be fundamentally a signifying process, but rather one of self-manifestation. As they used to say, as the phrase goes, is saying something is doing something, and that all of existence and life and politics and culture and history is all about what is done. Now, of course, everybody says, well, what about Foucault's discursive and his non-discursive regimes? And what about the way? And of course, that was the discovery of the concept of the diagram. The diagram was basically the hinge. It was that what permitted, if you like, and Foucault talked about this continually. If you look at the introductions to most of his books, and especially, let's say, to the Archaeology of Knowledge, he says that classical history tries to turn documents into monuments into documents, and what he tries to do is turn documents into monuments. Now that document-monument dyad is it's exactly the same kind of thing. So once you begin to understand that there were these fundamental structures, and which frankly, you need Deleuze to understand Foucault, especially today we do, because it is Deleuze who brings, if you like, those components that are not that apparent in the Foucauldian presentations. And brings them to the surface so that we can see them operating. Deleuze's reading of Foucault is very, very important for that reason, because it ensures the potential for a full reading of Foucault. And that's more or less my position. I don't know. I don't want to keep wandering, but that is something.
Well, I want to address that in relationship to the history of Foucault and Deleuze in relationship, because this is called Digital Futures. And I think Deleuze's book, Foucault, which was written after Foucault died, I think, is that right? Subsequently, I think they'd had a falling out, but Deleuze was asked to come and speak at Foucault's funeral. But I think the book makes it really clear Deleuze's indebtedness to Foucault in a way. If you're really following let's say the threads of the historical development of digital design, it owes as much to, let's say in North America, as much to Foucault as it does to Deleuze. And that the theory of the fold actually appears for the first time in my research in The Order of Things. And I think Deleuze takes it up in a very different way. He uses it, in relationship to a tradition of philosophy and models of mathematics. And it's, what Deleuze does is brilliant, and the way in which that crossed over after Derrida into Reichmann's hands, Eisenman's office, Sanford's work, all of that was super relevant because it was a way of getting architecture out of a certain, let's say, for lack of a better word, a lack of freedom because it was so beholden to the political constraints of discourse. But I think Foucault's work, because of its relationship to this problem of the diagram, continually opened up other fields of thinking about the relationship between things. And I agreed with a lot of the things that people had tried to develop with the development of digital design, which is we have to step away from these kinds of the games, the games of language and meaning and the kind of the problem of political discourse, because there's no longer any freedom to just produce design. There's no way to get back into the formal possibilities of design. What was interesting is that moment also came with a certain kind of political definition that was immediately lost. And I think Sanford held on to it for probably longer than others. And I actually had named Sanford, you don't know this, I named one of my pieces after a title from your essay, which is one of my favorite essays, which was about the diagram, and it's the hammer and the song. And I think that these features, if you come back to them, because Sanford, when you say it's it's about what you did, it's a whole series of actions. I think that carries back into the question of the practice, that it's not just the ability to make a decision, but it's a series of practices where you transform over time. And that is a certain tradition in Western philosophy and Western epistemology, and that Behnaz, you'd probably have a lot to say about this too, even with the tradition of how one encounters and practices the reading of the Quran. Christian penance is this, it's an isolated way to look at your thought, but it's carried over in Descartes, and it still is exercised, today, even in this institution, where the director will say, we're going to show you the difference between understanding and knowing. But what they don't say is like, well, is it knowing or understanding that distinguishes between knowing and understanding, and so on? And I think this question of the practice of knowledge, the practice of freedom in relationship to action, activity, the body, these are still, absolutely relevant. But I think that's what tears open a certain picture of Foucault and allows it to be manifest in counter-Foucauldian ways, but really productive ways in other contexts, especially with the history of Iran, even Tunisia. There's still so much that is not known about Foucault's work in those contexts. But one of the things that he, like in the Iranian tradition, he was really interested in the possibility of a revolution without violence. Like, what did that really mean? What was it possible? How is that possible? What makes it possible, this kind of amazing thing, where in the history of the West, all he sees is this inversion of politics as a continuation of war by other means.
And I remind you the Bataillean undercurrent in all of Foucault's thought, rarely accounted for, but in this case alone would be quite illuminating.
Could I just bring up something else? I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. I get a sense of all this discussion about what is being lost in translation. And I'm always reminded of Benjamin's kind of comments about the impossibility of translation. You can translate a word like, bread into pan or brought or something, but what you mean by that in different contexts is completely different. And therefore, something is always sort of lost in translation. It's kind of interesting. We got this discussion about Foucault, for whom the gaze was so important in many ways, but also for Said, in some senses, also from an Orientalist point of view, how the West looked at the East. But so too, there's a kind of, there's an Occidentalism that goes in hand, which maybe Behnaz is aware of, how the East looks at the West. And we have all these kind of different sort of questions about what has been lost in that moment. Today, the first time I've been aware of this kind of fracture between the kind of Foucauldian gaze and the Saidian gaze, in the sense that, but there's also another kind of gaze where I think things are lost in translation. That is, how do architects take this, and what gets lost or taken in that? And so I often get deeply concerned about the appropriation of some of this thought within an architectural context. Particularly, there's a series that have kind of like of thinkers for architects that worries me deeply in some ways. The first one, the only one I really know very well, is the first one that came out about Heidegger, which seems to be an instrumentalization of Heidegger. Now, much as I dislike Heidegger, I wrote a book called Forget Heidegger, I do think that is worrying that Heidegger gets appropriated in that particular way. And I was wondering whether Sanford, you've come across any of these thinkers about the Foucault for Architects books or any of those.
Oh, well, I mean, my bias, first off, is that, look, I don't even know when it was. I wrote a book. I mean, when I wrote it, I don't know, maybe it was 40 damn years. No, I'm lying. 30 years ago, the second chapter, if I remember correctly, of my first book basically deals with this whole Foucauldian problem. And all I want to say is that nothing has really changed. And I don't talk about it. I don't need to anymore. I tried to explain what I thought was a fuller way to use Foucault in architecture. And I think it remember this, it was called The Complex and the Singular. Yeah, I think that was the title of the chapter. But in terms of the Heidegger thing, I have to say, I've always been a bit repulsed by Heidegger, and also somewhat deeply attracted. And that's partly because, as you mentioned, because I am a Canadian, and because Canadians, most people don't know, they have one or two philosophical traditions which are very, very highly developed. And that has to do with really the philosophy of technology. And one of our very best philosophers, who is utterly and completely independent of Heidegger, was a Heideggerian. And he had an immense, huge impact on Canadian thought, et cetera. His name was George Grant. And I would say that, you know, for me, that's nothing, that's never going to go away. But I would say this also. I remember one day going after a lecture of Foucault's. I remember going up to go out with him to go have a tea, or he would go and he would always have a little Schweppes. You know, he had to have a little Schweppes, which is like these tiny little tonic water bottles. It was like a ritual right after his lecture at the Collège de France. And I remember he was carrying this big fat book, probably 800-900 page book. And the title was something Heidegger. And I said to him, I said, seriously, man. I said, are you kidding? And he goes, oh, you know, oh, oui. And then he tells me this was Henri Biraud. Henri Biraud's book came out sometime in those years. It was just out by Gallimard. It was like an 1100 or something like that page book. And he told me that Biraud was his teacher. And, you know, he was reading this book, and I would say, who's got time to read a 1000-page book on Heidegger? And then he said to me, he said, you know, we all read Heidegger religiously in those years. Heidegger was it for this group of intellectuals. They don't talk about it very much, but I was very surprised when he said that. He said that Heidegger for them was the equivalent of Foucault during those years for them. I don't know what years those were. I'm supposing those are the years at the École Normale. Those are the years of the equivalent of undergraduate.
Could I just chip in there? Because I had a very similar comment from Derrida that he's saying that, you know, my whole background was Heidegger, but my whole life has been a kind of overcoming of Heidegger. Now, what does surprise me about Foucault's work, that he does pick up on certain things, like, you know, techne is also kind of picked up in Foucault, but not in a kind of critical way. Given that Foucault, from a personal perspective, had a kind of Oedipal complex, shall we say, murdering the father. I mean, in terms of the kind of whole medical tradition out of which he came, I'm surprised he didn't take a more kind of Oedipal approach towards Heidegger in terms of kind of murdering the father.
Well, I want to remind you all, you probably don't know this, but Foucault's first book, which nobody's ever seen, he actually caught me reading it one day in the Bibliothèque Nationale. He came up to me and he just said hello, and he said, what are you looking at? And I was so embarrassed. I was sitting there reading a copy of his first book on Ludwig Binswanger. I don't know how many of you know who Ludwig Binswanger was, but he was an early phenomenological psychologist. And Foucault's first book was a study of Binswanger. And you could see bizarre pre-Foucauldian Foucault there. But Foucault began as a psychologist. You know, you also have to remember his degrees in psychology. It's in psychology. I mean, that's mind-blowing, actually. I mean, of course, in France, and this is important, in France, and especially at the École Normale, I don't know if this is still quite the case, but you know, in France, they study philosophy in high school. And the École Normale is very, very heavily, their curriculum probably today remains very, very heavily saturated with classical philosophical reading.
Yeah, I think in their final year, the final year is all philosophy.
And I mean, we don't have that. And that's why we don't have the same comfort, familiarity, and frankly, sophistication. I
want to point out one thing. Was it psychology or psychiatry?
Nobody knows what those words specifically mean. He was doing a kind of, his thesis was a kind of a history. If you read that, you can read that. That's in English.
I've read it.
Yeah.
But what he was trained, wasn't he trained in psychiatry?
He did a history of, he did his thesis was on a history of psychiatry. The title of the program, I mean, let's just say the discipline, I think was still called psychologie. And I guess one would have to look at the history of that from Charcot right up through, through contemporary French neurobiology to fully understand what that institutional rubric covered in those days. But I'm pretty sure that the rubric was psychologie, even though it may very well have been technical, because let's face it, he didn't have a medical degree. And in France, still, you would have to and he was not specifically interested in psychoanalysis. He was interested in the philosophical, he was interested in philosophical psychology, basically, very simply. That is why Binswanger was of interest and importance to him. But I don't know much more about it. I don't.
Maybe I just jump in on something that I'm picking up from what I'm also hearing. I think maybe also back to Peter's presentation by showing the artifacts from 5th and 6th century. I think the question that is fascinating for me to ask is how we normalized, right, in the context of Foucault, like who we give power and who has the power, how we normalize that, to whom we should listen to. And I think in the context of our contemporary culture, this is also very important topic, especially with the AI and digital design in general, how we normalize things, and I think the question of bias become really important, because at some points we are deciding something is the norm and the rest of it's not normal. And this is exactly go back again to Foucault's notion of the sort of normalizing, especially in medicine. Yeah, I want to kind of hear how you would both think about that, the notion of normalization and how Foucault was addressing that.
I think that became the more important both attack against, but also bridge for sociology and anthropology to evolve into sometimes Foucauldian kinds of discourse. Because I think that really started coming up when he was looking at the larger spatial or domain, if you like, problem of power beyond the institution, like the hospital or the asylum or the prison. And I think when he started really thinking about the way in which population entered the problem of power, he began to see what was already there in his earlier work, problems of the way in which, normalization is absolutely a spatial tactic. But I think those things are now, 30, 40, 50 years later, are now coming into North American academic contexts, along with their, terms like neoliberalism, which is actually, Foucault didn't invent that, but there are a lot of new kind of Foucauldian discourses that are emerging that are, they're really curious. I'm not sure what to do with them, because I'm never really comfortable reading Foucault back into a kind of quantitative analysis of anything. I think it's really weird. But one thing I want to do, kind of getting back to that though, Behnaz, one thing that, Neil, you didn't mention, which I think you probably think about all the time because you're running a university totally online. There's a lot of questions that Foucault brings up. Nobody really uses to challenge the institutions in which they function educationally. And I think architecture has really suffered from a lack of creative enterprise in education. I think architecture and architecture institutions right now are practicing the most refined kind of mediocrity you can imagine. And when I, hear students of mine talk about Sanford's class, it's like they're talking about going to visit the bedroom of their older sibling and learning all about life. They learn about Jimi Hendrix, they learn about all these things. There's something where your life is not distinguished between kind of what you feel, how you do, and what you read. There's absolutely this kind of folding back and forth of these elements. And I think architecture education is just become banal around the question. Why it's really interesting to see Behnaz take up the question of artificial intelligence. But I think that people are trying to use artificial intelligence the way they use digital design around Deleuze. It's just, I think the models they've exhausted themselves not because of Deleuze, but I think the way in which people ultimately just kind of, we're in third and fourth generation abstract expressionism now, and it's becoming kind of really inane. And so one doesn't hear the non-normal. I mean, one continually practices a normalization of stylistic techniques, of textures, of colors, of technological references. And something really has to happen to architectural education to transform that. But in the 90s, as Sanford will attest, because he was right there and part of that transformation, it was a use of philosophy. I mean, Deleuze, as far as I know, hated Eisenman's work. Didn't know it, didn't like it probably, or didn't think about it at all. But I think that we've lost that ability to spend time reading. We've lost the ability to kind of step away from digital techniques as a technological connection to the world and still practice things, practice conversations, practice, stepping into your older sibling's bedroom and discovering life again. I just think, when I look at your work it's still out there in the world, where architecture, I think, is retreating more and more every day from the world. I see it in the ornamentation. I see it in the excess of detail. It just reminds me of the Rococo. And we saw what happened, with the Rococo. Eventually, and we seeing it right now, there was a political revolution. And that the kind of discourse that happened in terms of wit and knowledge and the kind of creative impulses in Rococo, which are really wonderful, they're really fascinating, they're super destabilizing. The ancient Greek reference would be not necessarily sophistry, but a kind of a practice of making everything equivalent. And then I think we've lost the ability to have conversations about whether or not that's a good thing. And I think when you talk about AI is irrelevant because we're on Amazon. We're on Pandora, we're on whatever music you're listening to. I mean, it's not irrelevant to your work. What I'm saying is that AI is not new. The kind of the practices, and this as much as anybody else, that are embedded in our daily lives, we're constantly thought to think in terms of this grid of options. And the idea that we're now like constantly facing options of what we can choose and having something choose those according to who you are, this is, it's totally bizarre, but it's not necessarily a new feature of our lives. It's just becoming more and more explicit. I mean, that's my feeling about AI.
Sure. I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but the AI is also exaggerate all the biases, all the things that we normalize to the scale that if you're not aware of it, it might have some unintentional consequences that can lead to some undesired results, really, in the society level. So the question of how we are normalizing, how we are giving power to certain way of thinking in AI is crucial because the consequence is really large.
Maybe Peter, just got to add a quick reflection on that. I mean, I think you're right. There's been, to my mind, a kind of banalization going on within architectural culture, and I sometimes see this in the kind of like almost like postmodernism is kind of reasserting itself in some ways, and it kind of prompts me to think about a certain moment, which I thought was really one of the last great moments in some senses, when we're all kind of connected in some way through Bernard Schummi. I mean, he brought me to Columbia for a semester. You were there, and Sanford brought in Sanford as well. And he brought that, I guess, culture from the AA, which is was really being a kind of incredible test bed of thinking at a deeper level. I'm thinking here of people like Mark Cousins, the late great Mark Cousins, who would bring in this kind of this questioning and challenging, which forced us as architects to really consider the ground on which we're operating. And in some ways, I feel that something's been lost in this contemporary culture. So I don't know if you were referring to that, because Schummi, of course, came from this sort of the melting pot of '68 in Paris. He was educated there and so on.
Yeah. I think Sanford would also have a lot to say about this, because Sanford has probably worked harder than anybody I know to kind of de-architecturalize architecture by opening so many different things. I remember when he was teaching classes about African rhythm. You know, it's just kind of, what are the trainings you could have that would allow you to take risks in architecture? And I think maybe, Behnaz, that was really the problem, that the AI and data is really, it's all about security and minimizing risk. It's about minimizing economic risk. It's about like, it's control, but not in the way that I think we fantasize from the point of view of the Panopticon. It is about fabricating subjectivities of bodies, but it's all around the management, I think, of things like security and risk. But Sanford, I think, has always explored and doesn't care about it. Like, he can teach anywhere and he'll just teach what he wants to teach. But that's what I think a really challenging institution would be like, to take on people like Neil, like Sanford, but Bernard knew, because he went through that moment. And 68, even Foucault had said, if 68 hadn't happened, my work would be totally irrelevant. It wasn't well received. It wasn't really that well known before 68. And then the kind of floodgates opened. Is that right, Sanford?
I'm so glad you brought that up. Again, like this could go on for months, because truthfully, it's people like us, boomers, if you could say that. I don't know if you're all boomers. I mean, I sure am. There's nothing much I can do about it. But the fact of the matter is there is so much speech to just, if you don't pardon me, there is so much speech inside. There's so much expression of complexity that exists inside of us as we experience the transformations in our social and, frankly, knowledge world, our social and cultural worlds, that is essentially a response to trauma. To be a boomer today and to experience the contemporary toxic world is a trauma of a different order than that of those who are younger and who essentially are grown up and who are structured by that trauma. And I want to say that that is something, I don't even know where the hell this is going to go, but this is certainly part of our destiny in the next 10 or 20 years, because I can see in myself a complete erosion of my patience, as you can already hear it in some cases in my voice, is the sense that says, because of course I can feel my own mortality, but I also feel the mortality of the world in light of the, in every way, whether it be climate or just the toxicity of the social and national, situation. However, the thing what just triggered me was the invocation of 1968, and that has to be better understood. And 68 didn't mean the same thing exactly to everyone, but what 68 meant in France, in Paris, was really very, 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 very deep. And one of the reasons is because there was a release, unlike in America, there was a much more radical release of mores, of social mores. And that is to say, family structure, but also sexuality. It certainly was a major component in the in the United States, the most radically transformed society in the 1960s and 70s. But in France, because they had it was more rapid and it was deeper because of the Catholic nature, and because of the role, the earlier role of the church, and especially that internalization, if you like, of church morals, and the political nature and the aesthetic nature of that transformation and that release in France, and the impact that it had on everybody. When I was a student in France, it was everybody described their lives pre-1968 and then post-1968. There was almost nobody who did not feel that to be an absolute transformer. Whereas, anyway, I can get into that another time. I do want to say, though, that one way maybe of a shorthand is to say, the shorthand that always concerned me, and which draws up not really the battle lines, but which draws up the distinction that has made me unable to become very connected or interested in so-called Foucauldian or post-Foucauldian work, has to do with something that struck me as the core, the very, very core of Foucault's synthesis, if you like, of modernist thought. And Foucault had a very specific, and it was personal, frankly, it was personal, and there's a lot of interesting stuff on this in print. But for Foucault, we are material, biological substrate. We exist in a material and biological substrate. And that experience as bodies is unknowable. And it is that which is continually dragged into the light of knowledge. And in so doing, it is transformed. And in so doing, it basically creates, if you like, the toxic reality that we then, at all the next orders, in a way that we then need to negotiate. Now, Foucault had that capacity, and not a lot of thinkers have it, is to be able to address, if you like, I'll use the term I just used, the pre-light, the underlying, there's other philosophers who've used different names. I used Dionysian earlier. I could use Simondon's concept of the pre-individual. But for Foucault, he never lost track of the fact that that a political problem, a cultural problem, an aesthetic problem, just as Macapia was saying, it's essentially, there is only one problem. And it is the problem of life. It is the problem of how that substrate it endures creatively and spontaneously in its negotiation with others and with the organized world. Now, Foucault never lost track of that, but I think that, most Foucauldianisms ultimately did. So ultimately, in a certain sense, I would say that Foucault's ultimate topic was the opacity of experience, and writing that history is what he was doing. But of course, people really see just as if he was writing moral stories or moral tales. There's no final answer, as was pointed out, is that essentially, and they said it again and again. They said that you don't achieve. There's no triumph to be achieved and stored. It is that one's scholarship, one's living, the use of one's nervous system, the use of one's body, how one. This is something that needs to be a continual, creative, and exploratory process. There was a phrase that I glommed onto, which became my mantra during all the years in which I was doing my writing, especially when I engaged architecture. If Peter thinks I just do what the fuck I want, well, maybe he's right. But at the same time, there was always one idea that for me was the guiding one. And I took it right out of Foucault's little introductory lecture at the Collège de France, where at the end of some paragraph, or at least one of the sections, he talks about what he wants to do is to produce, or at least to bring to our perception, a materialism of the incorporeal, as if the materialism, in fact, was a universal mandate, and that there could be a materialism of the incorporeal, which is really where one sees the borrowings, if you like, from Freud and Marx, primarily, is simply to understand that and obviously, Nietzsche, it's ultimately Nietzschean, is that forces, there are everything in the world is a composition of forces. And he means that materially. So that's basically it. The idea that everything is a composition of forces, and that this is what I consider, that is what design is. That's why I see, essentially, when I said there's only one problem, and that's life, I see that ultimately this is what design is about. And this is why I feel like the Foucauldian, Nietzschean, Bataillean, Marxo-Freudian, whatever happens to be, that's why I always found it to be a great beacon. And, it is why I don't think there are boundaries on architecture. There should not be boundaries. And that's why, I think that it's important to bring those other things in, because they help us escape the platitudes of in which we live.
I'm just going to say one thing. I do have to leave. I have Halloween duties with my children. I just want to say, Behnaz, really lovely seeing your work. I thought it was really impressive, and I can't wait to see more of it and learn more about it. And I thought at the end with like the 1,000 eyes reminded me of a way of recapturing the misogyny of surrealism and turning it into something super powerful and contemporary. So I look forward to seeing more of that work. Sanford's always, I've never had a class with Sanford, so I just have to come to these things. I only came because Sanford was going to be here, so I never get to really hear him talk, except for we whisper things during faculty meetings, and he tells me these brilliant stories. And I feel like I live, in a like a motorhome. Like I've never been anywhere when I hear Sanford talk. So it's always a great liberating kind of thing. But Sanford, the last note I'd like to leave with you is that this is the one thing that Foucault had the hardest time defining, and which he was always on the brink of, but had to hold back, which was defining force. If he defined it, he would have to claim a metaphysical definition ultimately, and that's what he could not do because he had to remain with the material. So he can only continually invoke it, but I think that would be the one thing that really needs to kind of maybe evolve in a study of Foucault. Anyhow, thanks. I've got to go. Neil, it was a real pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. I think we should.
That was great, Peter. We got to do this more at Pratt.
I have to say I'm learning a lot from both of you, so thank you. And this was a fantastic session. Really, I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely, and I think I learned a lot myself. I didn't know that Peter was studying under Gayatri Spivak. I didn't know that Edward Said wasn't so uncomfortable with Foucault, and many other things kind of opened up today. I think I just want to thank all three for this amazing session. I mean, to me, it's been a Pandora's box in many ways. And Sanford, you brought Foucault to life in a way that I didn't know that you were reading in the colored books that he was going to see you in the library. I didn't know all that at all. And it's just made Foucault, I mean, so relevant today. I mean, some ways, I think the question we're asking is what has Foucault what do architects got to learn from philosophy, from Foucault? The answer is clearly a lot. And is Foucault still relevant today? Absolutely. I think this was the main thing that came out of our discussion today. But maybe I could leave you with a final word, Sanford.
Well, I don't know what to say except that there was one thing that just came to mind as you were speaking, and that is that I remember on another occasion when I went up to Foucault, after his lecture, and he was carrying another big fat book under his arm, and I was also shocked by it. And you know what it was? It was the recently translated Tale of Genji, like 1,000 or 1,200, 1,500 page book, The Tale of Genji. And he was like reading it, and he had it the following week as well. In other words, he had dedicated days and days and days to reading that. And I remember on the one bizarre occasion, which I won't go into now, in which I was at his apartment on the Rue du Vaugirard, one thing I noticed about his bookshelves is that they were jam-packed with literature and virtually literature only. And then there was a shelf where he explained, he would read systematically. He would read virtually every work by a given author, and that he would have them active on an active shelf, et cetera. And he would just be plowing through, literature. Literature was a very, very critical part of his reading. We don't hear about it very much. Of course, he wrote a little book on Raymond Roussel, but nobody actually reads that. Or he wrote an essay on Blanchot, et cetera. But what we don't know is just how powerful the poetico literary really was in his general habit. I don't know what else to say to you except for this, is that I don't see where one would go today to re-engage Foucault. I just don't know. I don't feel optimistic. But one more thing I wanted to say is, those of you who are interested in AI, in case you missed it, yesterday there was an article on the front page of the New York Times, which was it was interesting though, a very, very short thing about a book that is about to come out by this guy named Schmidt. Did anyone see that? I definitely think, Behnaz, you ought to have a look at this. And obviously, Neil, you would have this. Apparently, this guy who worked for Google, he was the head of the, I guess, whatever, he was head of some aspect of Google for many, many years, and who helped develop many of their algorithms and so on. Apparently, he's about to release a book which sounds unusually intelligent to me in terms of his emerging concerns about AI. Anyway, that little short article in the New York Times, if you can find it, I found was a surprising. It was a surprise. It was something we got to start to pay more attention to. It may not be up your alley, Neil, but it should be up everyone else's. Is that AI is the tide is turning, if you like, on AI in terms of the fascination with its novelty. And I think we're going to be entering now into a very new moment. And yes, perhaps a Foucauldian alertness or vigilance may now in fact find a flourishing as we begin to realize that we live now in a very different regimen, a different regime. We are going to need a new way of understanding the, quote, materialism of the incorporeal.
Thank you, Sanford, for those kind of closing remarks. I mean, absolutely. And my next book actually is on the dark side of AI, so it'll be something that'll be kind of very useful. I just want to say that, what's becoming so interesting about this dialogue in the last 3 sessions, between this one is that it's been very much about this kind of transatlantic dialogue that's been going on about the reception of content philosophy and so on in the States and so on. Next week, we'll be dealing with Frederick Jameson, of course, who was the one American scholar who really looked towards the critical theory tradition and incorporated into his discourse. And of course, we have Michael Hayes joining us, who is maybe the chief kind of like commentator in some ways in the Harvard scene with that sort of world. And also we have Michael Speaks, who, like Sanford today, studied under Jameson. So I'm just hoping that maybe things will come alive in the same way they did in an incredible way today. I just want to thank Sanford for his huge insights and for opening this Pandora's box. Super interesting. Thank you, Macapia, as well. That was amazing. And Behnaz also, such fabulous work. So let's hope that we can continue this dialogue next week. All these are going to be uploaded onto, if you just go Google Digital Futures YouTube, you'll get the library of things, including Sanford's talk over the summer, including Slavoj Žižek, including Erin Manning, and so on and so on and so on. These are a repository there for the future. And I think this is the purpose of this thing, was to really to lay something down as a kind of a kind of contribution to future scholarship. And I think that's what's happened today. I had no idea how it would evolve, but it's been an amazing session. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you next week. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great fun. Thank you. I was so not looking forward to having to do this morning. It was great. Loved it.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Behnaz. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.